one.
Hello everybody, this is Glenn Maurer and we're here again for another episode of the Next Step TVSB. You can see these shows on Ustream, the Next Step TVSB, or YouTube, the Next Step TVSB, and Google for those of you who are interested in seeing them. And today you might want to do that because our guest today is Professor John Foran. John is a professor of sociology and environmental studies at UCSB. Been there since the late 60s, if I recall.
Me, no. It's 89.
89, oh, misunderstood. And he's also the co-director of International Institute for Climate Action and Theory.
Yes.
So that's an important and impressive title. But I mentioned that we've done this show before, and one of the shows we did before with Professor Foran was on the global climate change issue. It was called the hottest year ever. And you can go back and look at that. And that was like a year ago, a little less than a year ago. And the idea, the impetus for that show was that we had reached and recorded temperature that was something like 1.3 degrees higher than had ever been since highest average since 1880 when they first started keeping these records. So it was an increase of 1.3 degrees in the global temperature. And that was the nexus for that show, if you will. Mm-hmm. And sort of we talked about global warming, just the general idea of global warming. And that was also associated with this group that you're participating in, the COPS group. Tell us about what COPS is.
The Conference of the Parties, is an annual UN climate summit. All the nations of the UN, 196 nations, gather for 2 weeks, usually in December of each year, and they've been working for the past 4 or 5 years toward a new global climate treaty.
And there's another program, actually as this show airs, we expect that you will be in Paris for the next of these conferences.
Correct, COP21, the Conference of the Parties, number 21.
So that's the first couple weeks in Paris of this month in December in Paris.
That's right.
And you'll be there, we hope. And the project will be an extension of the work that was in South America. I'm trying. Lima.
Last year was Lima, Peru.
Lima, Peru, and the project is going to. One of the things that I've noticed since the time of that project in the media, in the public media, and I'm not a scientist, and I don't study this all together real closely, but just like we had that data on the hottest year ever, we now have information about the concentration of carbon dioxide. If we can get that chart on the screen, and maybe we can see that in the chart, there is atmospheric CO2. And here's that chart. It shows from October of 1958 through last month, the concentration as measured has gone up on a consistently steady, regular, clockwork basis to the point where it's just about to penetrate 400 parts, which is a huge increase from what we had back in 1950s, about 300, roughly 300. So maybe a 30% increase. Tell us about what that means. What is the concern about that CO2?
Well, these numbers are parts per million, so of our atmosphere. 400 parts per million doesn't seem like a lot, but as you just pointed out, it's gone up whatever percent that is, from 300 to 400. And carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas. There are others, and therefore this number marks an effect which will translate into warmer temperatures, because that's how global warming works. The more carbon dioxide up there, the more heat that's on Earth doesn't get radiated out into space, and slowly the temperature will rise as these numbers rise. So it's very important to actually halt this increase and bring it down to the level of about 350 parts per million. That's what climate scientists think is a safe operating space for the planet.
Hence, one of the more active and effective organizations, 350.org, right?
Correct. They take their name from that number.
Take the name from that number, 350. But we're up at 400, going higher. And I think, as a lay person, we have to understand that this is, they call it a global blanket. It's like this gas stays in the atmosphere, and instead of allowing heat to extract it, it keeps it on the planet.
Yep.
And it warms the water.
Yes, in fact, it warms the water first before it warms up the temperature that we're so concerned about. So the oceans have gotten a lot warmer and a lot more acidic.
And I know this is sort of simple ABC stuff to you, but it helps me to explain it to the folks out there. So carbon dioxide is produced by human activity, and it can be differentiated from carbon dioxide that is produced elsewise by volcanoes and other things. I've read that there's scientific tests. They can ascertain absolutely which of this is human produced. Mm-hmm. So who's producing this CO2?
Most of the CO2 that we're talking about here is human produced, and the basic way that we get more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is by the burning of fossil fuels, whether it be oil, natural gas, or coal. And secondarily, the second biggest and most threatening greenhouse gas is methane. And methane is produced in industrial agriculture, so especially meat and dairy agriculture. And there's several other ways that the things that we do naturally in farming and in other processes increase the degrees of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
We have a chart, again, another chart, if we can get that on there, showing this, the contribution of carbon dioxide at least, to the atmosphere by country. And there's a big change over the last, about 20, 30 years, from 1990, and this projects going through 2030. So it's a 40-year projection from 40-year history to 2030. And I think this is important for the public to know, because there's been a perception and a true statement that the problem is Western European and American production, because of the industrial age began there, and that's where we have the most factories and we have the most automobiles, and just a generalized, more industrialized society producing a lot more materials in the air. And the third world countries and second world countries were not producing that much. And yet, in that chart, we can see that the burgeoning economies, especially of China, are a huge percentage now. In fact, China has overtaken, I think, the United States, and Canada as being the largest, and European maybe being the third. Was China a party to this conference?
Yes, all the nations of the world are party to this conference, and what's significant about the treaty that they're negotiating is that every nation in the world is supposed to take measures to create a collective solution to this problem. China did pass the United States around 2007 or 2008 as the leading producer of carbon dioxide. But the number 398 that we just looked at historically is the product of 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, led, as you say, by Europe, the United States, and a few other wealthy countries. So while it's true that China is extremely important for moving from now additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but what's also true is that the wealthier nations of the world have a historic responsibility for warming the temperature to this point. So it's going to require cooperation among all parties.
Yeah, I think a point can be made there. If we go back, we have another chart, a third chart we'd like to get on the screen there, and this would help maybe make people understand that even though the chart just showed that China had, in total volume, and is projected to continue to have, on a per capita basis, which is this. I mean, how much does each individual member of that society contribute per capita to the carbon dioxide pool? China's pretty darn low. China's down there sort of the third from the end, right between Brazil and Indonesia. And at the far highest per capita is Canada, which I don't think the world would understand. Is that coal tar and oils?
I guess that's tar sand production because they're a huge exporter of very dirty fossil fuels. At the moment, their economy relies on that.
And then the next one, per capita. This is the per capita amount that we consume or produce by nation, by population of that nation, is the United States, and then the Russian Federation. I'm a bit surprised by Japan being up that high. Well, and then the European Union.
It's because it's largely a measure of consumption, so that if you're in a society that consumes all kinds of gadgets that requires industrial production, that's one way to have high per capita emissions, and the other, of course, is to be a fossil fuel producing country. So that's what Russia is, and Japan is a high consuming country. The U.S. and Canada are both.
Yeah, and I think this is the point we're trying to make, the difficulty of going to a conference that you're going to. And you can point the equities in so many directions. You can say, okay, China, you are the largest producer of these gases right now. It's your job to do the most to reduce it. And they say, no, we're per capita one of the least. You guys have a historical obligation because you've been polluting for 200 years, and now you want us to stop.
Well, the final irony is that about a quarter of China's emissions are spent in their factories producing the things that we consume here, that we import and buy cheaply from China. Whose emissions are those really?
I was going to say, and that was my next step, was that they point to the fact that, I don't know if it's a quarter, but whatever the number is, a huge portion of their material, of their gas production is to produce exported goods.
So there we have it.
So we don't need, if we didn't buy those exported goods, theoretically that pollution would not be produced. Or alternatively, if we were producing those goods in our own country,
right,
it would be that high.
That's right.
So what is the idea of the conference? I've heard this idea of fair shares. So how do you reconcile these conflicting statistics and arguments about who's to blame, quote unquote, with the imperative to do something and to do it in an equitable way?
I'm smiling because it's very difficult to reconcile all of that, and that's why we're in the 21st year of negotiations for this particular treaty. It's the 4th year, and they have set the deadline in 2015 in Paris to have a treaty, and yet the treaty consists of a very unwieldy text with many different proposals in it in brackets because they're not agreed on. And they've left some really difficult issues to be resolved in a very short, high-pressure situation, which is very reminiscent of what happened in Copenhagen in 2009 at COP15, when again the world was told to expect the climate treaty that we needed, and they were unable to agree on anything.
I would think, I'd venture that most Americans, in fact most people in the world, have only the vaguest idea of what this group is and what power it has. Does it really have any power to bind anybody to anything? Potentially it has tremendous power because it's really the only level of global governance that could produce a climate treaty that would affect everybody and involve everybody in the world. And it's under the auspices of the United Nations, so the UNFCCC, as we call it, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was established in 1992 as the world began to become aware that there was a problem. And the negotiations, the COP started in 1995, COP 1. COP 3 in 1997 in Japan gave us the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first global climate treaty, which applied only to the wealthy nations of the world, making particular emission cuts on a certain schedule up to 2020. And what happened was 10 years after that we realized that emissions were still going up, and partly because those countries weren't meeting their targets, and partly because we had new players, China, the leader among them, India, Brazil, other global southern countries were starting to industrialize at a great rate because we were deindustrializing in the global north, and the jobs and the factories were going to these places. And so that's when they said we have to have another treaty. And they tried to do that in Copenhagen in 2009, and they failed, and that's when they reset in 2011. They said 4 years from now we will have the treaty that we want, and it will require everybody to participate in it. if one thinks of carbon dioxide emission and methane and other gas emissions, not, in the same way one thinks of pollutants that we throw into rivers and waters and radioactive material waste and other things that are clearly per se dangerous, just, and we all sort of understand that.
Yeah.
People have a harder time with the idea of gases, I think. But if we think of that in that way, isn't what's happening in a certain degree maybe what's happening in that same field, where companies faced with responsibilities of working in a European environment with regulation and monitoring, or the American environment with some regulation and monitoring, are going to take all these factories, as you alluded to earlier, put them in environments in which they are not monitored, and they can continue to create this kind of pollution into the atmosphere. How could that be stopped? I just don't know what the mechanism of enforcement would be.
Well, before we can get to the mechanism of enforcement, we have to have a global agreement that we're going to set certain targets and we're going to require certain actions on the parts of countries. And that's really what's at stake in this negotiation. And if we want to look at what has to happen in terms of cutting emissions, we're again looking at fossil fuels primarily, and to some degree agriculture, industrial agriculture, and that means that we're looking at the need to keep a tremendous proportion of all the fossil fuel reserves in the ground in order to stay under dangerous level of global warming. Now, that level has been set at 2 degrees Celsius. That's one way to think of. There's a kind of relationship between concentrations of carbon dioxide and then
2 degrees
temperature
Celsius and atmospheric warming.
Of atmospheric warming, correct, which is about, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what's one thing in the treaty is an agreement that's the goal, to stay under that. Now, and then to take the measures that would get us under that, which means cutting back these greenhouse gas emissions, which means less fossil fuel burning, a lot less fossil fuel burning, and a transition to renewable energy, which is really what this is all about. It's about a kind of global transformation of our energy systems to renewable energy, which is clean and safe and won't raise global temperatures.
And we've got some numbers on that, which I found. It's estimated by the estimates I've got that in order for this atmospheric warming to stay under these 2 degrees centigrade, total emission of carbon will have to stay under 3.2 billion tons. And I don't know what that means. I have a hard time concentrating on the idea of gases and tons.
Okay.
But anyway, it's a huge amount of material, but it's a lot less material than might happen if left unchecked.
Yes.
And in order for that to happen, one of the things that people say is going to have to occur is that we're going to have to agree in some fashion that a huge amount of the hydrocarbon resources known to exist. Mm-hmm. I remember in the 60s, in my day, when they were talking about running out of oil all the time. They were always talking about running out of oil and coal and all this stuff. They never ran out. Right. And there's a huge amount more out there now. But anyway, there's about that total emission of 3.2 billion tons from the beginning to now.
Okay.
Now they say that there's another 1.2 billion tons in the ground or undeveloped. Is there any way, can you imagine any way, in which it'll become illegal or unavailable to use this resource?
Well, there are different ways one can imagine, of which this treaty process is one. The other ways are, we would start to talk about the other side of achieving these goals, which is movements, social movements around these issues, to put pressure on governments and to put pressures on the corporations. And here now we're talking about a vast network of organizations that goes by the name of the Global Climate Justice Movement. And when you started to talk about what would be fair and equitable, the best word we have for that is about climate justice. And so my argument is that what's going to happen in Paris, unfortunately, is not going to achieve the goals in terms of either emission reductions or maximum temperature thresholds to stay under, or providing the resources that the poorer countries of the world are going to need to leap over fossil fuel electrification and get to renewables. None of that is really, seems to me, to be on the table or something that global northern countries are actually going to be able to agree to in Paris. And thus we come to the proposition that the only way for that to happen is for a very massive uprising in the term of the social movements to put pressure on governments. And that's why I'm going to Paris, to be with hundreds of thousands of climate justice activists who are there to do that, to try and draw attention to the inadequacy of the negotiations and to draw attention to alternatives that exist. And there's a whole 2-week program outside the conference which is going to showcase this in various ways.
Well, that would be certainly a grassroots kind of concept. If you can find a way to get people to, on their own, just start supplementing carbon burning processes by using domestic electrical solar panels, or I know there's lots of ways this can be done that people can reuse their own personal consumption.
Yes.
But that's admirable.
Right.
But what about the idea that can we see a system in which the quote-unquote fair share idea, where each country could, is there a way that you can imagine where 80% of the population, governments representing 80% of the population of the earth, could agree that there is a fair obligation they can equitably allot one to another that we would all agree to?
Well, part of the medium-term, let's say, strategy of this movement is precisely that, is to elect governments where that's possible and elect parties and representatives who take this viewpoint, which unfortunately we don't find anywhere in the United States. The closest thing that we have to it is Bernie Sanders' campaign, where he is speaking almost on the level of urgency that we need to talk about this. But that's, of course, a long shot and a rare candidate. So really we're going to have to see real political change, I guess from the bottom up, but ultimately translated into new sorts of governments that are willing to do this. And we have little hints of that here and there, and we're just going to have to keep pushing until we do have that.
Well, even in the, I mean, you and I both share some cynicism about the current direction of the Democratic Party, last 40 years direction of the Democratic Party probably, in a sense that they've abandoned some environmental and progressive positions, and some of them are terrible. I mean, we have President Obama who wants with all the above strategy, they call that, which means that we would allow people to burn coal and oil and natural gas and even have nuclear facilities in order to make everybody happy.
Yes.
And yet he does talk about limits on carbon cap. Is that a viable thing in the American political scheme?
Yeah, it's the right idea. Obama has moved enormously in his second term, and particularly in the past year and a half, away from that sort of, on the one hand, I'll support the fossil fuel corporations, and on the other hand, I'll try to reduce the output of greenhouse gases. He's become a lot clearer on that. Of course, he can't get legislation through a Republican-controlled Congress, and so he's doing whatever he can on the legislative level. And so we have these new requirements, these new regulations on automobiles and on coal plants. And these are movement in the right direction, but they're woefully short of what's needed. And so we're in a situation where what's needed is more than what seems politically possible at this time. And again, therefore, we're back to ordinary people coming together in some really strong and creative ways to create new institutions, to create a new sort of mindset to give us the leadership that we need. Because the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, are essentially elected using money from fossil fuel corporations.
Koch brothers especially, and others. Well, but they did stop the pipeline. I mean, there's other dynamics in how that happened.
It was a social movement that stopped the pipeline.
Movement,
absolutely. There we go.
And so that is an example of work that can happen. And then, so American representatives, and can you imagine, what do you think is going to happen? You said that you thought the conference would come out with an inadequate result, not sufficient to the test, but maybe something positive. Anything that you think is going to come out of this that's positive?
I think the best possible outcome here, I'm sorry to say, would be that the countries that understand that their future is at stake and that the negotiation, both the process and the substance of the treaty are inadequate, would use their veto power at Paris and withhold agreement, and that we would end up Paris with kind of no results. And that would mean that we wouldn't have an inadequate treaty, and moreover, we wouldn't have that being put forward as a success on the part of Obama and many countries of the world. And thus, we'd be back to the drawing board, which is really what we have to do. We're going to have to go forward in 2016 beyond whatever the outcome of this conference is to try and take the steps which would require really imaginative, radical, yet possible, because they're necessary, steps that we have to take as a civilization.
What countries are the leading advocates and implementers of these type of programs right now? Which countries
The countries that
we want to follow?
That we should follow and pay attention to are the countries on the front lines of climate justice. And so the small island states, Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and many others. There are 40 such states. That's out of 190 votes, if you want, inside. Countries all in Africa, which is going to be affected the most by rising temperatures impacting agriculture, and there's some leadership there. Other countries in the global south in various configurations, Bolivia and Ecuador in particular in Latin America. And I think we're going to see that. There's something called 20 countries in a block called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is everyone from Afghanistan and Bangladesh to some of the small island states. It's a very diverse group, and they're all calling for a 1.5 temperature limit rather than the 2.0 that's on the table. So they could they could get stuck at any number of places in this process.
Is there any industrial country that is doing more than others? I mean, that's a better way to put it. Okay.
On that, yeah, some of the European countries, particularly Denmark and Germany, have gone the furthest in their commitments to decarbonize their economies and the furthest in their action. So Germany, without nuclear power, which they decided to get rid of after Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, is now at a point where on certain days 60-70% of their electricity is generated by renewables.
We're about to finish. If you got something you want to tell us before we go, now's the moment.
Well, what I'd like to say, I think, is put in a plug that if you want to follow what's happening in Paris, we will be posting information on our website, which is theclimatejusticeproject.com.
And people can get that online. And also, I know they can contact you at your own, you have an email blog or a place that you send out a lot of material. I get, how they get onto that list?
I think to get on that list, you would simply email me. It's Foran, F-O-R-A-N, at soc.ucsb.edu, and I'd be happy to put you on a list, and you'll get all kinds of information you can't get anywhere else.
Thank you all. Back there on the stage, Juanita and Allie, and thanks to the TV station for letting us do this show.